Hi, this presentation is essentially about ways we can provide appropriate feedback to students on online courses without this placing a huge burden on teaching time. We've looked at three different aspects, and there's a short presentation on each of these.
I would now like to draw your attention to a possibility on how one can reduce the amount of work for the teacher. May it be for an online course, as we discuss it here, or a campus-based course. The method I'm talking about is peer review. So what exactly is peer review? And what exactly are peers? A peer group is a group of people that are similar, for example in regards of their age, their background, or their social status. In our case, it would be in regards to their status as students of a specific subject. Peer review is now the evaluation of the work of a student by his or her peers, hence other students of the same level, not by the teacher. Peer review differs from peer assessment in the way that a final assessment, such as the marking of the work, is not made by the students, but by the teacher. I would now like to give two examples of how peer review could possibly be set up. The first is through the use of an online forum. Any questions the students may have should be posted on an online forum, where the peers can answer them. Of course, this method is highly dependent on the students actively participating, as in posting and answering questions, which means they need to see the benefits of peer reviewing. A functioning online forum can reduce the workload of the teacher immensely, as he or she is only required to answer those questions that peer reviewers were unable to answer. The other option is to arrange the students into groups in which they need to work on individual tasks. Potential questions about one's task can be sent to group members, which have to answer these. An example for such a workgroup task would be a medical case study. Each student is given an ambiguous patient description, which could indicate a range of diseases. The student needs to analyze the symptoms, discuss possible illnesses, and needs to reason for what he or she thinks is the most likely. The peer reviewers then comment on whether they agree or not, and why. The teacher, in this case, only needs to confirm that questions are asked and answered, and to provide the final solution with the reasoning why it would be this particular disease. As most things, peer review has its advantages and disadvantages. Advantages are that students often find it easier to talk to their peers rather than to a teacher, that students use their knowledge when explaining their thoughts to others, rather than just learning it by heart for the next exam, and that it releases some of the pressure on the teacher to answer questions from all students in a short time span. Disadvantages, on the other hand, are that students that evaluate might be too strict or too easy on their fellow students, as personal feelings may play a role. That evaluating students might have problems themselves to understand a particular subject, hence the quality of comments they can provide is limited. That options to peer review are ignored, for example because students don't see the benefits of peer review. Or that the opportunity to peer review is misused, for example by the use of abusive language, rather than to answer or to criticize constructively.
I set myself the objective of investigating how student expectations can be managed in relation to feedback. I tend to think of feedback as a component of formative assessment, however, and got drawn into reading some literature on student attitudes to assessment in general. The report pictured here was produced by the Higher Education Academy last year and presents a rather depressing picture of how developments in assessment have failed to keep up with the changing context of higher education. Struggling with student perceptions of feedback and the workload this can appear to require is clearly not restricted to flexible, open or distance learning. The report proposes 6 tenets, and one of these is that assessment literacy should be incorporated into course design. Essentially, I think this means that best practice requires students to be taught about the principles and practice of feedback as part of their course. This is obviously the most direct way of influencing student attitudes towards feedback. Incorporating assessment literacy into course design requires students to be taught about why feedback is important. Nicholl and Macfarlane-Dick based their ideas on an earlier definition of self-regulated learning. They claim that the primary purpose of feedback is to promote this and develop 7 principles of good feedback. The second of these is facilitate the development of self-assessment or reflection in learning. There's an implicit assumption here that investing time early in a course to develop a student's ability to reflect on his or her own work may reduce reliance on external supports from teachers later on. David Boud develops this in asserting that feedback must develop students' ability to make judgments about what constitutes good work. Boud is particularly critical about approaches to assessment that make the learning dependent on feedback from teachers, pointing out that this constructs barriers to continued learning outside the formal education environment where such feedback might not be available. Again, if students have developed abilities to judge the quality of their own work, then they will be less reliant on feedback from teachers. O'Donovan and colleagues consider how students' understanding of assessment and attitudes towards it can be developed. They outline how early assumptions that students would simply pick this up have generally now been supplanted by making explicit documentation of assessment methods widely available. They claim, however, that this is insufficient and that students need to practice assessment and feedback themselves to fully appreciate how it can work to support their own learning. They provide evidence that providing opportunities for this can improve outcomes of learning exercises.
So this is one section of our presentation about supporting learners, where we looked at a case study that involved a new master's course and the number of students requiring massive amounts of feedback, and potentially this could overwhelm the tutor due to the sheer numbers. So I looked at supporting learners from the angle of how can your structure of the course help to minimise the implication of feedback on the tutor, and also fit in with the idea and structure of some of the things we've been looking at in terms of online courses. Most of the information here comes from the insights we gained as a PBL group with discussion, and I based the kind of model and idea on something found in Kumi and Stevenson's chapter within Stevenson's book Teaching and Learning Online, Pedagogies for New Technologies. So this arrow is taken from that chapter, and they call it their online paradigm grid, and it explains some of the different elements of how you can set up certain tasks, particularly with an online course. So in the first one, which is probably as we discussed, is something you would do initially when you start an online course like this, where the teacher is the instructor predominantly and the control of the task done in the lesson is with the teacher and the tutor. So this is where the feedback comes mostly from the instructor rather than providing students with feedback from their peers, as they're obviously all getting to know each other, and it's something that you want to set up. And here you can teach them the tools for online participation. So at the start, perhaps in terms of supporting learners and feedback on the work they're doing, at the initial point, perhaps it should be more from the tutor. So in terms of workload, when you're introducing the tools and the online learning environment and things like that, the feedback and support that learners get on the course is primarily from the teacher initially, so that they can then set things up to take the kind of onus away from the tutor. So when it was talking about this northwest quadrant, for example, these are the kind of things it suggests that the teacher is the instructor, and again the control is mostly with the teacher. Then when they're switching, going to the northeast, so this could be something where you would move on to tasks like this, for example, where the teacher is more of a coach as opposed to an instructor. And you specify the tasks as the teacher, so the control is a little bit more with the learners now, and whether that you can then split them into smaller groups so that they start to rely on each other for feedback on what they're doing and also to collaborate in smaller tasks. So in terms of supporting their learners, you're still there to support them individually and as a small group, but they now start to learn how to support each other, particularly in doing a particular task. And again, this will encourage interaction between them and will build on the online tools that you will have set up and taught them initially when you did more instructor-led tasks, for example. So getting them to encourage to listen to their peers as well as you, but to get the feedback coming from all of them, we thought was something that you need to find a fine balance. And maybe it moves on to instructor feedback a little bit more in terms of group tasks, but then you allow them to go off on their own. Then in terms of like the southwest quadrant, perhaps the teacher becomes more of a guide. So the control very much is with the learner again. And the tutor just guides the groups in terms of what they're working on, and they decide on what they're working on. So this is very much like our working groups, for example, our PBL groups. So we have a facilitator as well, and these kind of things in the lower half of this diagram tend to be more focused on the students providing feedback to each other, and then the tutor being there if and when they need it, more for guidance rather than for feedback on what you're doing and how you're doing it and learning from each other. So again here, perhaps in order to encourage that and make the students still feel like they're supported, even though the onus is more on them and their peers, providing models to structure online feedback to each other. So, these are the questions I'd like you to answer, for example, when you are looking or reviewing other people's work and that kind of stuff. And then again, this is very similar to the Southwest one, but here is again a little bit more open. So the feedback doesn't necessarily come from the tutor, but they go out and they find it from external sources or experts. So again, this could be other peers, other groups, putting their information out there online and getting people to comment on it as a feedback thing. And again, the teacher being there as a facilitator, so they're still supported if they're unsure where to go, but they are still there to support the students, but the control is with them, and they would build up to some things within the southeast and southwest quadrant, for example. And again, you could define guidelines for tutor feedback and peer feedback. So when you give tasks like this, in order for the learner to feel supported and know what they're doing, define what the role of the tutor is in this task, but also define what the role of the peers are in that task, so that everyone's very clear. And perhaps later on, I think certainly as we've worked on the FDOL course together, doing different tasks, each of us have come to understand more about what is expected of us in terms of the PBL groups, what is expected from the facilitator. We feel more confident to do things ourselves and also comment on each other's work, and they've encouraged us to comment on each other's work, and defining guidelines of what is expected for each people later on would hopefully be something that would encourage the learner to still feel supported by the tutor. But again, it doesn't involve massive amounts of presence from the tutor anymore, because you set that up. So these are just some thoughts that we came up with in terms of how can the structure of your course really reinforce the idea of supporting your learners. Even though it's online, how can you create the environment online or the virtual environment to be something where all learners feel supported throughout the whole of the course? And how can you still encourage collaborative learning and innovative learning online without making the students feel like they're out there on their own?